Today we're going to talk to RJ, one of the most interesting and enigmatic figures in the digital art space. We're going to ask him about his use of pastiche, concept art, and what it is that makes him tick as an artist. Artist Journal, June 14th, 2023, broadcasting live from Berlin and New York City on Rug Radio via Twitter Spaces. My name is Adrian Pocobelli, and we welcome back co-host, artist, and conversationalist to the show, Runetoon. How is your week going?
My week's going pretty well. Glad to be here. Nothing exciting to report, I suppose, just kind of plugging away. How about you, Pocobelli?
I am doing pretty good. The search for the apartment continues. It's just a web of madness out here. I think every big city is that way now. So that is my main preoccupation, is finding a place to live. I have some leads, but of course everything has has to be qualified, and everything is kind of like, it's always a story of some kind. It's a tight market, as they say out here. So that continues, but progress is being made, still making art, making having very interesting conversations. Which I'll hope to bring at a very soon. Just Ordinals thing is the little teaser I'll give you on that one. That's getting very interesting over here. So anyways, I'm always thrilled when you come on, Rin, because I'm always worried you're going to have a late night, and you've shown up every single episode.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't miss it. I kind of plan my day and night and everything around this show, to be honest.
Well, I totally appreciate it, because my Wednesdays are also planned around this show as well. So it is deeply appreciated, and it is totally not unnoticed. RJ, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us, and I'm so excited to have you on and everything. How are things going with you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on. It's strange to sort of be on after watching so many artist journals and listening to these. So it's slightly surreal.
We might still have a little bit of audio. The noise isn't so bad in the background, but you might need to talk louder. And it's so great to hear that you watch that show. I mean, watch the show. It's always so amazing for me, because it's like I found these, your art on Tezos Object, probably about a year ago. And so it's always surreal for me, really, to be in this situation where I'm talking to these people and that they actually watch the show. I mean, it's like a daily, I'm almost like Groundhog Day, where I forget everything that everybody's ever said about the show and I just start new. And I'm always kind of amazed that people are still watching. So I totally appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really useful thing for just seeing what's going on. So much is happening constantly that it's a nice sort of digest every day. It helps you sort of keep on top of everything that's happening. So it's always appreciated.
Well, likewise, and I appreciate the comment. And so, yes, and it is amazing, isn't it? Like, I mean, despite sentiment being not so great in the crypto markets, it is incredible how much is going on a daily basis. I mean, don't you think?
It's crazy, definitely. I think the amount of, within this sort of the space, as it were, the amount of art that you can be exposed to, the amount of sort of new innovative art that you can be exposed to all the time is crazy. I don't think I've ever looked at anywhere near as much art as I do now, being on Twitter every day and seeing people constantly producing stuff that's really different and new. And it's not, as you say, it's not really stopping. People sort of complain about the market, but keep on producing. So it's a really great thing to be able to do, to log on and just constantly see all these really interesting pieces being made all the time. It's great.
I agree. And it's almost like, even if crypto disappeared, which I don't think it will, but even if it were to disappear, it's almost like we'd use views as being the new measure of how well a work is doing, rather than the amount of Tezos or ETH that you're selling for. So yeah, I mean, it makes you just really bullish and happy about the space. Really, tell us a little bit about your background. I mean, if I had to guess, I would guess that you're, someone that went to art school or something, and maybe even came out of painting. But I don't know. What is your background in the arts, and where are you calling from, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm calling from London in the UK. I didn't go to art school. My background is in literature. I actually started off studying classics, which is why I get very excited whenever I see you mention Plato. And then I did a master's in modern literature, and then I did a PhD in contemporary literature. And so sort of came out of that the end of 2020, 2021. And yeah, it was sort of how I sort of first got into NFTs, because I came out of that having done some writing, and I thought that it might be an interesting thing to sort of put it on the blockchain. So that was sort of how I got into it. But yeah.
Have you always had an interest in art?
Yeah, art's always sort of been there, and definitely from reading a lot of sort of art theory during the PhD, there's sort of it's been there alongside the sort of literature. So it was a nice little pivot that wasn't too sort of outlandish.
It's quite interesting to me that that's the case, because it seems to me that you kind of have this, what I almost am tempted to call, for lack of better words, like a natural eye. Because they're, as I put it, like your works, I find them quite poetic. In like, there aren't many works that I actually buy on ETH just because they're so expensive for me. But it's sort of like I'm always really excited to pick up a work, because I just feel like there's something to these works that, what I guess it comes down to who you are really influenced by, and I guess that's kind of like the title of this program today. I mean, it seems like you're very influenced again by, I think is it Edward Hopper?
I always say Edward. I have no authority on this though.
Yeah, and Hockney, David Hockney seems to be another, just this. So what is it that kind of turns you on, so to speak, in visual art? It seems like there's something kind of particular, maybe something about the light, the psychological aspect, which maybe harkens to your kind of literary background. Can you just talk a little bit about, what excites you about the visual arts?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, visual arts primarily, I think what's really interesting about it for me is that it's sort of it's just the fact that it's a means of communication that isn't verbal. So whatever you're trying to communicate, the idea to me of a piece of art is that it's sort of supraverbal, so that it's doing something you can't otherwise do. So it sort of should sort of say something inexplicable, really, I think is what I like about sort of visual arts. And then, yeah, definitely the sort of the Hopper and the Hockney pieces that, or sort of artists, and that I find sort of just really sort of stimulating to look at. And I think it's something to do with the sort of, with the interiority. I think I like sort of domestic scenes, and I think that there's something about the way both sort of Hopper and Hockney paint, even though they're not, it's slightly different sort of points in the sort of 20th century. There's something slightly inaccessible about both of them.
It's interesting looking at your work. Like, I've seen a lot of Hockney, I've seen a lot of Hopper, but I never really like drew a through line to those artists' bodies of work. Like, they seemed like they've always existed as such different artists, but like you're using their kind of attachment to the interiors, as you're saying, is like kind of bringing them together like much closer than I had previously seen them.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something about, especially those sort of the double portraits of Hockney, the way in which the sort of figures relate to the sort of environments that they're set in, that has a very sort of Hopper-esque feel to me. And And I think they're both working in a sort of a history of sort of in sort of the history of realism, but doing so in, I think, as you said, probably quite a sort of psychologically informed way that sort of says something about alienation from either sort of other people or sort of the environment around you. And I think that I don't know whether it was sort of lockdown or because I sort of got into making all this sort of during lockdown. I thought there was something that was still very relevant about that feeling, and there's something I think that's relevant about it in Web3 in particular, because even though we're sort of connecting on Spaces and we're tweeting all day, and it's still primarily this sort of solitary activity of being at home inside alone with a computer or laptop.
There's a lot of research to show that even though we're plugged into something that's so massive, everything on Twitter, everything on the internet, you don't usually step away from the internet with a sense of like, it's easy to step away with a sense of loneliness, despite the connection you might be making with other people through the internet.
Definitely. And I think that becomes really interesting as well when you're using the internet to sort of make or look at art, because I think so much of looking at art, if you're sort of doing it in person, is about sort of the experience, or perhaps some sort of form of emotional reaction that it might sort of trigger standing in front of a painting, for example. So I'm sort of interested in what the feeling is when we're looking at sort of art on our scrolling and looking at art on our laptops, and how is it different to looking at art in sort of person, and there's sort of questions I don't really have answers to, but I think that there's something about that sort of very strong sense of interiority is something that I find sort of really interesting in these paintings. And then I think they're interesting because of that element of disconnect that we might also experience. Maybe they express something about that disconnect we might experience even while looking at sort of our online friends' art on Twitter, which is sort of counter to what you might expect art to do. Maybe if art is sort of generating feelings of sort of connection or a sense of sort of, I don't know, community, then does it really do that through a screen? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I think this is super interesting. Like, in a sense, there's something very, tell me what you think about this. Like, there's something very, I would say, modern about your work, in the sense of like almost like capital M modern, almost like turn of the century, almost like the alienation that you find in a lot of writers, like, James Joyce, maybe even Hemingway a little bit, and just like the sense of alienation. And it's almost like you've, for lack of a better term, appropriated that kind of alienation that, again, is kind of almost like World War I type of sentiment, and you've kind of recontextualized it as a kind of in the context of our relationship with technology, as you're saying, with the screen and the sense of alienation kind of reimagined in the context of the age of the internet, where we're all together but all alone at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. I think I can't remember off the top of my head which one it is, but I think the Nighthawks by Hopper was supposedly inspired by some Hemingway story as well. I think The Killers, I think it was. So definitely.
Is that right?
So I think it does all tie in. That's definitely not far off.
Very interesting. So now you've used a lot of, and correct me on I still am always like, am I using pastiche right? I'm pretty sure I am. You use a lot of pastiche in your work, where you'll use another painting as a kind of as a launch pad, so to speak, and then you'll maybe add a laptop or a screensaver and this sort of thing. With that recent series that we saw in Yellow and Green, which I thought was so thoughtful, and enigmatic. Are you still using pastiche? This is my burning question for you, RJ. Are you still using pastiche there, or are you starting to make your own compositions here?
This is sort of really interesting, and it was very good fun to sort of, I actually sort of watched you looking at these and sort of having this question, because I think that sort of slightly, that sort of sense of uncertainty is definitely something that was sort of being punted at for that. But they are not direct pastiches. Instead, they're based off of AI compositions.
I love it. That's what I suspected.
So this
actually,
is,
I was like,
so the original, the compositions
brilliant.
are made from sort of Hopper Hockney-esque sort of AI products that I've then painted and then added in. So it's sort of like the way in which the pastiches would have been working is now happening off of a sort of, and again, this sort of comes back to something you were talking about a little while ago about sort of copy. It's a copy of something that doesn't exist.
Right.
You know, it's interesting looking at a few pieces now where I'm seeing both the Hockney and the Hopper. I think part of the reason that I see these two artists as being so much closer is because of the way that you've created these images, where the AI kind of takes the things that made Hopper so particularly himself and everyone else so particularly themselves, it kind of blends them in, and it makes it's interesting.
Yeah, I think the sort of that uncertainty is really, I think, a key element there for me. That sort of which if you're sort of aware of the sort of previous work on the sort of computer art collection makes a bit more sense. But that sort of, that feeling of, is this real or not? Does this refer to something that already exists or doesn't it? Is something that I'm sort of really sort of interested in there. And I think in a way it's sort of is an extension of the sort of the presence of the laptop, as sort of the idea, as sort of put in the descriptions, is that we're never not in contact with the internet now. We're never not apart from technology, or even if we are, it's only until we get back to it. And sort of that's what's underlying these paintings themselves, is that they're actually they're sort of a product of this technology as well.
Yeah. So, go ahead, Runtun.
I'm just kind of curious. You said that, like, so all the stuff that we see on the blockchain that you've made, you said you started making those during like the original lockdown from COVID. Were you doing stuff like this before that?
So I was doing the actual sort of path I took when I started was, as I said, it was sort of first sort of text based. So I'd written this sort of novel, and I thought, I can maybe stick this on the blockchain, and then I thought, maybe I didn't actually do that very well. And then I sort of started doing, the very first thing I made way back on sort of Hic et Nunc was some sort of it was like an interactive poetry sort of thing, but I couldn't quite figure out the interactivity, and so I had sort of these Google Docs where you could sort of request the link, and I'd send the link, and then you could arrange the poems on a sort of set background and then screenshot them, and I'd upload and mint that sort of thing. And so I was doing a little bit of text work. And then the first sort of step towards this was really what's the sort of genesis piece now on my sort of on Object, which is when I started then combining the text with these sort of computer screens, so that the computer was sort of speaking out, and that was sort of where this path sort of started. So it was very much sort of a screen in a room, but from that point it sort of broadened out to look more into sort of how is what we're doing here related to the sort of traditional art world.
Very interesting.
Fascinating. And Just as far as you mentioned Hen there, RJ, how did you get, like, were you a crypto person before you kind of got into the NFTs, or were you brought in with the 2021 bull market like many people, and all of a sudden just thought, hey, why not? Let's participate in the incredible speculation where everybody's getting rich making art. What's your story as far as just finding yourself with NFTs and crypto?
Yeah, it was sort of the other way around, really, in that I had something creative that I wanted to share and put out there, and I'm quite impatient. So looking at sort of sending this piece of writing off to publishers, I couldn't bear the sort of waiting period. So I started looking at how else I could, put this thing out there, and came across sort of the blockchain technology that way. So I was not unfortunately not a sort of investor who was making tons off of the bull run, but happened to sort of come in anyway at the same sort of time, and had a great time on sort of the early hen days. It was a really great just sort of environment and atmosphere, and there was a real sort of urgency for all of the art. I think it was just really interesting, and definitely something that I thought, I want to sort of stay involved in this. This seems just really good fun.
And you said that you started with writing. So were you actually putting, like, I didn't quite understand that. Were you putting writing on the blockchain somehow?
Not quite. No, I had sort of. I don't know if I'd be able to find them now, but I had. They must be there somewhere. I sort of on a different wallet, I think, which I've probably lost all the keys for. But no, I'd had sort of. There were like collages, and then I had sort of sections for sort of nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs, and they were movable. So you could, it was on sort of like it was on visual art, but then the words were overlaid, and you could move the words around and create a poem yourself. So it was sort of, the idea was that the reader was the sort of poet.
Fascinating. And welcome everybody who is listening in here. Feel free to join us on stage. You can come hang out with RJ and Runetoon and hang out here and ask him a question. If you have a burning question, just send me a request to speak. I will bring you up. And so, RJ, it seemed to me perhaps that you had taken a little bit of a break at some point, maybe, I don't know, 6 months or a year ago. Did you take a little break at some point? And it seemed like you kind of came back.
The back end of 2022, I think I had a sort of couple of months off. And then so coming back I think I sort of started up again probably about January this year.
Yeah.
And which was sort of my first foray into Ethereum.
And how have you found that? I mean, I think you've done fairly well. I mean, I remember when you were posting, like, on Hen, it was doing okay, but it seems like you have actually done, like, in terms of from a market perspective, but it seemed like, and it was doing well.
Yeah.
And I was out there collecting with others, but it seems like you've, really started to build something substantial here in the last few months. And how does that make you feel? I mean, again, you never really studied art, but does that make you does it grow your ambition as an artist?
Definitely. I think it's all just really interesting. I think there's so much here that's so interesting that I sort of just need to keep thinking about it. With Hen, for example, I'm always interested in why and how the markets differ, and I again don't really have answers for it. But it's sort of interesting to me that Tezos does just seem, or work that's placed on Tezos does just seem to struggle to attract the same sort of pricing, and I probably don't know enough about the actual sort of blockchain and the different sort of currencies to really understand why that is. But I've found, Ethereum really sort of work, and I think that it's perhaps something to do with even things like user interface. I think the sort of the paratext of the way the art's sort of presented are sort of important, and I think Foundation does that well. I think it sort of sits. I think sort of paintings sit slightly more predominantly on Foundation that helps sort of back up an idea of sort of value somehow. Not.
I think you might be onto something there. Like maybe just the big thumbnail itself, and I also like how for whatever reason, the default on Foundation seems to be like, start an auction.
Yeah.
Whereas on Object, sometimes it feels like you can start an auction, and unless you're like really hammering away at Twitter, every hour, that people will forget about your auctions and very easily. Like I've picked up all sorts of work that people just forget about, but if they knew about it, they would have happily bid way more.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't have nearly as much experience with ETH-based minting, but I think part of the reason is because of the gas situation with ETH. People are minting far less frequently. With Object, with Tez, you really don't have to worry about an artwork doing well or not. Like you can just put something out as much as you as frequently as you choose, and there really aren't enormous consequences. And I think it's the most people are not going to mint as frequently on ETH because of that. And so when you are looking at artwork that's on the Ethereum blockchain, that this is, kind of the slow and steady, this is a serious piece.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think. But actually using Tezos is even not just the gas fees, but the actual use of it. It feels quicker. It feels sort of more responsive and straightforward.
That's also true.
And I don't know. I think I personally find, for me, I personally find doing things like editions more stressful. I think we're already doing a lot through sort of creating and marketing, and for me, sort of choosing editions and prices is almost the hardest bit. I find that it's just much more straightforward to have a 1 out of 1 at this basically set price. I think that just takes some of the sort of stress out of that for me. And trying to bear in mind anything like, what was this last priced at? Or if this is a greater number of editions, how should the price respond to that? All of this is, I think, as much as a curse as a blessing sometimes.
Totally. It's a learning experience every time. And there's nothing worse than like, I just did that. I just minted like 40. And then I was like, oh my God, that's way too many. And then I was like, an hour later, I'm burning 25. I'm like, okay, like to your point, it's a learning experience every time. And whenever you think you kind of have something figured out in that respect, then you learn some more.
Yeah, definitely.
So I want to actually, you touched on the user interface part, and that's something that's kind of excited me for a long time, is actually just the user interface as subject matter. As a kind of clue into, it's kind of like I think, I don't know if you read Ballard in your contemporary literary studies, but it's kind of like this anthropological set of, he talked about ATM machines, like how he, just examining an ATM machine is some kind of anthropological exercise to kind of understand what humanity is and what's going on, what is human nature. And I feel like the user interface also provides that kind of these clues really into who we are and what it's, what we're all about. Is that part of what draws you to them, or is it something else, or all of the above?
I think a couple of things based on that. I think there's one thing I really like in sort of quite a lot of the art that's being put out, or in some of the art that's being put out at the moment, is when the sort of the interfaces of, or you see sort of the brushes of Photoshop or the palettes being sort of included in the artwork itself. And I think I sort of, or even if anything's referencing the sort of the interfaces of foundation or object or whatever it might be, I see it not quite so much from a sort of anthropological point of view, but I see it more as a sort of, I tie it more closely to the sort of postmodernist mode in literature, where it's sort of a foregrounding of the objectivity of like the book itself, or the process of creation. So I find that sort of inclusion of the sort of I think I called it earlier, the sort of the paratext of the creation really just really interesting in the artwork itself. But when it comes to the sort of the actual user interface of being on something like Foundation, I think it's more, I think that we're not just trying to sell stuff, basically, that there's got to be an element of sort of exhibition. You could mint things and never sell them and just sort of have your page as your own sort of exhibition page, as it were. And I think sort of the closer things move towards that, the sort of nicer the experience would be almost. And I think Foundation's a little bit closer to that, the way the sort of collection pages sort of function. I think it just looks a little bit more gallery-esque.
There is something. Sorry, go ahead, Brenton.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's like a very interesting extension of, I think, the conversation we've had many times amongst ourselves, talking about, oh, well, if crypto goes to zero and everything's wiped out, we're still here producing. I think you're touching on something that's kind of important, because, you know, social media has always been around, Tumblr's been around, all these different sites that I can think of from my childhood where it was just kind of sharing art and ideas and images. It doesn't have the same, those places never had the same feeling to me as exploring art on these platforms that are blockchain based, where there's a market behind it, and you're right, it's this kind of this curation is happening in a different way.
Yeah, I wonder if it's definitely there's a certain effect, I think, when I don't know, whether the market itself and the ability for something to be sold means that perhaps it's taken seriously in a way that it isn't on something like Tumblr. So the actual viewer experience of looking at something on Tumblr versus something that's potentially trying to be sold is a different one. And perhaps the thing that's trying to be sold is, I don't know, it's given a little bit more sort of esteem. I don't know. I think so. Things like the gallery app, for example, that I think it's just really nice to see digital art be given a sort of home that respects it as art, as opposed to perhaps more sort of social media content.
I think there's also something to be said about, you know, the artwork itself being simply part of a blockchain. Like, you know, I can't put a physical painting on the blockchain. I could take a photo of it and do that, but there's some sort of extension to the content that we're sharing through blockchain based platforms that I think there's something there that's like kind of in the back of our minds, where it's like it lives in a certain dimension that is kind of, it's new. It's not the same as just like sharing photos on social media. And if I think about my own experience sharing art and things on social media versus the way I operate sharing things on Object or Foundation, they're totally different. The motivations are totally different. The kind of the way I edit myself is totally. I mean, like, I'm assuming that you've had experience sharing artwork or your creative stuff on something non-blockchain.
I haven't.
Based.
I haven't.
No,
this is why.
Wow. So this is really the first for you, the first kind of
So
Wow,
this is why I'm
that's
sort of,
so
yeah,
interesting.
find it really, really interesting that there's a whole, the standard way of doing it is doing it, putting something out there into a sort of, I don't know what it must have been like, a void where it's sort of being seen, and that's
Yeah.
it. Where the idea is, I hope people see this and like it. I think the experience of looking at something that's being put out just to be seen is probably different from the experience of looking
So
at something that is blockchained and purchasable. I don't know.
how it like how I mean that's kind of interesting to me. Like how would you describe your relationship to like sales? And I mean, I'm assuming like just like anyone else, you're excited to make a sale, obviously, but sometimes it feels to me like if I don't get a sale, it means that the artwork was not very interesting to the audience.
Yeah, I think.
Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
and I think that probably everyone has that thought to some degree, and probably feels that whatever they've made is not good enough if it doesn't sell. But I think I'm
Right.
sort of,
And I'm just that's that is more of like kind of the base, sort of
yeah,
reaction to something, even though if I know, you know, consciously like, okay, that's not necessarily the case. It's just one of those
yeah,
kind of like emotional reactions that can happen when sharing
yeah.
creative work through the
I
blockchain.
think it's sort of a difficult cycle, though. It's a tricky cycle, because I think that if one sort of pandas, if one is sort of trying to create art or something that is likely to be popular, then ironically it will probably be less so. Is sort of a feeling I have. I think that sort of with regards to sales myself at the moment, um, yeah, it's nice because it's a mark of appreciation that somebody wants to hand over something sort of physical in return for this sort of abstract ownership of something. It's sort of the sort of serious sign we have that, yes, I like this, basically. But I also think that for me at the moment, just being able to sort of participate in this whole ecosystem and have stuff to think about all the time is like mostly what I get out of it. So I'm sort of happy just to sort of sit here and sort of think about these things and like have the opportunity to put it out there. And if people like it, that's like brilliant. But I'd probably still be doing it if they didn't anyway, just because it's just really an engaging thing to be doing. I don't think there's much more exciting going on in sort of contemporary culture right now than this. So just getting to sort of,
I would have to
yeah,
agree.
I would echo that sentiment, and I'm glad you feel that. I'm glad you voiced that. That's a actually very interesting, kind of simple but very profound thought, because I completely agree. I mean, if I thought there was something more interesting, I'd probably talk about that, and at least like kind of like pivot into that. But it's like I completely agree. And what's so interesting too is it's maybe like 2 or 3 thousand people. It feels like sometimes. There's a lot of familiar kind of quote unquote faces out there. And just on the selling, I mean, it's kind of like my take on this is it's like there's a real like brutal market dynamics, and it does, I think, shape the art to a certain degree. And I actually think it's healthy for the most part. Like, I think it's forcing people to make art that people want to buy. And there is a cost to that, of course, in some cases. You don't need to have to sell your work. You can have experimental work that you're okay with not selling. But I think it does force people to kind of bring their A game, because in a weird way, I mean, as Runtun was discussing the social media versus, say, the blockchain, where you're selling work and how that's kind of different. I agree. It's almost like in its own way, as small as it is, and sometimes as low as the sales are, a few dollars, it still is a professional platform
Yeah.
because people are buying and selling. There is an audience out here.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I know you've mentioned on sort of various sort of artist journal shows that actually the fact of selling anything at all is now possible and happening, even if it's not quite the same as sort of 21 Bull Run. Just that fact alone is still sort of astounding that's possible and happening regularly. I mean, if you look on Object, the sort of daily sales, it's always churning away.
It's incredible. I mean, yeah, like, so there's a lot to be kind of hopeful and grateful for. And again, if anybody wants to come on stage and join us, your chance to ask your burning questions to RJ, simply put a request and I will bring you on stage. RJ, you're talking about a lot of kind of just deep thoughts here. I want to go back to a little bit your literary training. So, like, what was, you said it was like contemporary literature? Because I think this kind of shapes a lot of what you bring to the table, maybe in a certain way, even though there's no words. We might call it kind of there is a literary feeling to your work. Again, I think of like Joyce and just like, again, this alienation of the modernists. And so talk a little bit just about like, what did you write your thesis on, if it's not too complex for you?
Yeah, it's definitely shaped very sort of directly what I make. And yeah, so even it sort of like stands as sort of what art school would have been, basically, I think. But I wrote on the way in which exactly those sort of authors are used in very contemporary writing after postmodernism. So there was a lot of sort of postmodernism in there, then sort of asking what comes after postmodernism. And my sort of answer was a return and a redeployment of a lot of these sort of canonical modernist texts. So the sort of way, it was sort of about the ways in which writers of the 21st century were exploring and referring to and then using those writers like Joyce and Proust and other people from sort of 1920.
Fascinating, because I mean, it seems to be almost, you have a direct visual translation.
Yeah,
in your
I
art.
think that, so yeah, a lot of it was sort of about the sort of theory of intertextuality and how sort of precursors are looked back to and then sort of responded to, and sort of how that idea of influence is sort of negotiated. And yeah, so when I'm sort of pastiching or referring back to a lot of this art, it's the same sort of modernist type art that I was sort of of the same period of the sort of the modernist text that I was sort of working on, and a lot of it just sort of, a lot of those interests have just sort of been directly sort of translated across, because now is this sort of period of sort of transformation and change where there has been this sort of new technology that's opened up a whole new sort of arena of art, and I think it's sort of interesting at this moment to sort of think about how it sits next to and alongside or with what's come before.
It's interesting how, I guess I hadn't, this question that you just posed, like what comes after postmodernism, and you're saying it's this like return to the canon. That's what we see every day with NFTs and the stuff that Pocobelly shows on his journal, is these artists kind of returning to the classics and rehashing them in a modern way.
Yeah, I think that if you sort of look at I don't know, very broadly, I'm speaking again mainly in sort of book terms because I don't have that sort of art education, but if you sort of look at the sort of postmodern as sort of destroying sincerity through sort of irony, then after that there's a bit of a sort of, okay, what do we do now that everything has been sort of deconstructed? where do we go? And sort of the response to that is often to sort of look back to what came before the sort of deconstruction. And even if it's not being used in the same way, it's still sort of perhaps present as a sort of touchstone. But yeah, it's interesting because I feel now that I see a bit more of that. I think of, but it was interesting to see, to sort of seeing it happen on sort of a micro scale with things like, well, it's basically sort of meme culture as well. It's sort of these touchstones were also being created at the same time, and then these sort of new memes like Pepe being sort of like remixed with sort of classical sort of iconography is just bizarre to see happening in like real time. It's like, what is going on here? And it's just, yeah, really interesting to sort of to see it happening after having sort of studied it in books. To then get to watch it playing out live is great fun.
It is quite interesting, and it's almost like an unconscious embrace of the tradition in a certain sort of way. It's a way of just, yeah, like, who knows? As far as the writing, just to tie a bow on that whole subject. So it sounds like you have like writerly ambitions. Is that a fair statement?
Fair, but they're sort of backburnered now a little bit. There's some writing floating around, but at the moment I'm having sort of more fun doing this. So,
I mean, you're doing it so well that, yeah, like, I think, and there's nothing like, again, getting rewarded by the market for you to feel like, oh, maybe I should be doing this over, writing my novel that maybe nobody will read, and, work on that for 20 years. My friend has done that. It's not an uncommon story.
Yeah.
It's a hard world for writers now. The attention spans are not as high as they used to be.
Yeah, definitely.
It's so true. So true. And so what's coming up next, RJ, as we're in like the closing 15 minutes here? Tell us what are you up to next? I mean, again, that last series I thought was maybe a new summit for you. And I kind of, again, like that whole kind of like, I almost want to call it like a spectral pastiche. It's like this pastiche. I kind of suspected it was, I thought either you were collaging, like taking out figures from previous paintings, because they really had a kind of a Hockney look to them, but they were not paintings I recognized. So I thought that was just a wonderful series and a wonderful use of AI. To me, that's very much one of the things that really excites me about AI, is using it as a compositional tool. And I think you're doing it in a really interesting way. And you also are a bit of a tracer. And I use that, like Warhol was a tracer. I'm a big tracer. Do you have any thoughts on, say, before you go on to what's coming up next, just on tracing? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm all for whatever creates the sort of output that's going to sort of work. I think the interesting thing with pixels, I think, is that, I mean, ultimately you look at anything online, anything on a screen, and it's pixel art if you zoom in enough. And so a lot of actually what happens in the sort of translation of this stuff is it's more a sort of process of almost simplification than tracing, because you can't trace pixel for pixel. It doesn't work. You would be, I don't know how many singular pixels you would have to be using on on any sort of given canvas, but it would, I guess you could work it out, but it just wouldn't work. So it's sort of it's as I said, a process of simplification that's it sort of, I think, changes things in a sort of, again, a way that's just introduces a slight sort of sense of uncertainty. There's something different, but it's sort of a little tricky to put your finger on what it is. And I think it's perhaps this element of sort of reduction in a way that introduces a certain sort of perhaps sort of flatness or boldness or something that I think is good fun. That's interesting to see and really good fun to do.
It is interesting. I mean, as you're speaking, I thought it's like almost like there's interpretation going on, of course, when you're tracing, quote unquote, tracing, right? I mean, to your point, otherwise you're literally tracing it is really just you know, copying pixel for pixel what's happening. And I actually quite love what you say. When you zoom in, it's all pixel art. That is an interesting addition to the conversation.
Yeah, I think you know that's one of the things that I think draws me to pixel art is that whenever you're looking at anything on a screen, it's fundamentally pixel art because it's on a screen. You can't get away from that fact. It's just how many have you got. So I think this is something fun about pixel art. It has an awareness of that fact. It's sort of toying with that the medium and the form of what we're looking at. It's just sort of self-conscious about that, which is sort of what I like about pixel art.
That is another beautiful thought. It's almost like it's like taking digital art at its kind of elemental core. If I understand you right.
Exactly.
Right? Like it's taking the basic unit of digital art. Is that fair?
Yeah, entirely.
I love that. So tell us what you're working on, what you hope to do. Like where are things going here?
Yeah, what have I got? I've got a what have I got? So I've got a little piece up at the moment on Foundation, which was sort of a self-portraiture one, which was quite good fun because it's probably more recognizable for the actual fact of the work being copied onto the screen as opposed to the sort of anything figurative. Because obviously there's nothing to identify any, you know, most of us here, or me at least, beyond. So what does a self-portrait become when you can't recognize the person? So that was quite good fun. I've got a piece for Explainer Gallery that I think is sort of dropping, as it were, or sort of being listed tomorrow. Then a fun project for the end of July that I don't know if I can talk about. And then I'm just in a bit of a phase of sort of exploration at the moment after this sort of last project to see what comes up, and just sort of I don't feel too much sort of pressure to be creating, as it were. So it's quite nice to just sort of wait and see and find something that interests me, and then just sort of follow it. I think that's sort of how I sort of tended to work, and so I'll see where that goes. But I haven't sort of finished that last one and then gone straight away like, this is now what I'm going to do. This is what's next. So I just have to wait and see. I'm having lots of fun, exploring sort of AI collaging and things at the moment. It's just mad what it can do, and I think does, again, it's just hyper contemporary. There's nothing more sort of more modern than this right now, and I think that there are lots of possibilities with it that are really interesting. So I think I'll probably be playing around with that for a little bit, and then and just see where things go.
Beautifully put. A wonderful statement there. So I have another couple of questions here, though. So first on the self-portrait, are you that dressed up?
No. Definitely
okay,
not.
I'm relieved because I was like, maybe I need to up my game here if I, in my little T-shirt here.
Yeah, that's.
Something funny happened to me when I was seeing the tweet that you made, where it's the one that I shared here in the spaces. It was late at night, and I somehow my mind skipped the self part of self-portrait. And I thought that was a portrait of Cocobello.
It's the outfit is looking similar.
The screenshot, it shows him in this button-up shirt, and the shirt is the same color, and he's got that dark hair on the back. I somehow imagined that was a portrait of Cocobello.
I thought the same thing when looking at that tweet as well, actually.
I don't normally tuck in my shirt, but maybe I will. I thought that guy looked very handsome from the back. And I thought, like I want to be the guy who's like looks that good while he's working. Like, so me, it was like, geez, RJ's wearing a suit while he's working here. And it's it made me feel, I was like, that's what a pro is doing. I love that piece, by the way. Has anybody bid on it yet?
I don't think so. But again, I think I quite like every now and again checking the sort of foundation homepage, and you see like 30 live auctions to 180,000 reserve, and it's mad that sort of ratio. I think is just means that their level of expectation should be sort of commensurate to that. So it's really just, I think it's all about making something that you like and are proud of, and then sort of getting to share it, and you're sort of already winning at that point, I think.
Excellent. And just one more question here, and you don't need to answer this, but just in terms of, do you have favorite softwares that you use? And if you want to keep it a secret and everything, that's cool too. But just curious, since we talked Shopio too.
And it's actually the software in that most recent portrait work. It's literally called Pixel Art, and it's just a free online, like, I don't even know, site that I use, and I like it because it's sort of very limited, and so you sort of have to work within the restrictions. I've sort of played around on Aseprite and Photoshop and things, but I just sort of enjoy the sort of simplicity of this one. And yeah, if you just Google pixel art, I guess drawing or something, you'll probably find it. But yeah, that's literally what it's called.
And are you using a mouse, or do you do a Wacom?
I use a trackpad.
Okay, so that's like, so you're using
I'm using my finger.
Is that correct? Fascinating.
Yeah,
that is fascinating.
I don't often see. I've seen some tweets being sort of, I make my art with a mouse, and I've sort of wanted to say, well, I use a trackpad, but yeah.
Very interesting. It makes a difference, like I make a lot of art on my phone, and you do get a different kind of art, mark making, than you will with, say, an iPad and a pencil, Apple Pencil, or, a mouse, or, whatever the case may be. Like, using your finger itself does kind of produce its own results sometimes.
Yeah, it's also interesting, just the different sort of options that are now available to make something the different ways you can do it. It's a whole new as I've said, sort of arena. It's no longer just sort of, well, what brush are you using, but yeah, are you using a trackpad or a Wacom tablet, or it's just really interesting.
Fascinating. And one more question: what are you reading right now, if anything?
What am I reading? I'm actually reading right now Sabrina by Nick Dranso, and then I've also got Francis Bacon Revelations, which is the big sort of biography on the go at the moment.
Interesting. And okay, one second last question, then I'll turn it over to Runetoon. But you said you studied classics. Were there any? Did you study a lot of, like, Plato, and could tell me just a tiny bit about your kind of classics experience?
So read lots of Latin and Greek, and then in my final year I specialized in ancient, classical philosophy. So did a lot of Plato and Aristotle, and then a lot of the pre-Socratics, and it was good. It was good fun, and definitely informed a lot of my sort of academic perspectives. It's sort of that is the sort of foundation. It is sort of what I tend to go back to.
So do I. Yeah, and it's simply. Sounds like you went to a pretty good university over there in London. I never learned ancient Greek or Latin, just certain words that were significant out at the University of Saskatchewan there. But it was, yeah, I mean, it really did change my perspective. And it's just, there's something about the classics that are really, I guess, for lack of a better word, inspiring and beautiful.
Yeah, well, I think what I really like about it is the sort of the long term view, and it really sort of changes, I think, the way you think about the contemporary, because what you sort of might think of as sort of ultra modern might have actually already been sort of done 2000 plus years ago. I think this all the time when reading what are sort of supposedly currently sort of very avant-garde texts, and then you can sort of think like, oh, that was being done in Latin poetry, sort of whatever BC. So yeah, it's interesting. It sort of, I think, highlights the way in which culture perhaps sort of tends to cycle a little bit more, and what you might think of as completely and utterly new turns out not quite to be so.
It's very humbling,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So that was my sort of classics experience.
Excellent. Any final thoughts for everybody out here, RJ?
It would just be thanks to anyone and everyone for tuning in, because this is really mad to be doing this. Yeah, and I think sort of 2 odd years ago, back on sort of Hen, I don't think I could give away 10 editions. So this is now sort of completely surreal.
Well, sorry, continue.
Yeah, and just thank you.
I'm so thrilled you were willing to do this, RJ, because you are a bit of an enigmatic figure out there in Twitter, and you just never know what people are going to say. And so it's a huge delight for me. And I tell you, like, I knew there was depth over there. And after this conversation, that is like confirmed 130%. So I'm very excited to do this. And Runtun, do you have any final thoughts or final questions, comments for RJ?
No, you took my last question, which is what is he reading? No, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, RJ.
It's been great. It's been really, really great. So thank you both as well for hosting. It's a joy to take part in something that's doing so much good for sort of all the artists out here. I think any sort of any attention that can be given to anyone who's sort of out grinding away is just always going to be super appreciated. And so, that's why I think this sort of the Artist Journal show is doing so much good, and these spaces as well. So just thank you guys.
Well, thank you, and too much fun. And thank you also to Runtun, and thank you everybody out here who came out and supported us out here and is listening. That is not lost, and it's an all-star crowd here once again. So thank you everybody, and until next time, take care.